Look at the place where you are right now. Look at the walls around you. Look at the corners. Look at the ceiling above your head. But this time, don't just look with your eyes. Honestly ask yourself, does this house nourish you, or does it slowly drain you without you even noticing? When you wake up in the morning, do you feel your home welcomes you, or do you just feel four walls containing you? Because there's a difference between living in a house and inhabiting a home with a soul. A long time ago, on a night that would change the world's destiny, a knowledge was revealed that wasn't written in books, but was kept silent for generations. Three plants, three living presences, three simple keys that can transform any house into a space where divine energy finds its place. And the third, the simplest, the one many have without knowing it, holds a secret that connects to the morning of resurrection. Stay until the end, because when this video finishes, you'll understand what's missing in your home and how to restore its spiritual strength. Now, write in the comments, "My home opens to the light." And if, by writing that phrase, you feel something ignite within you, if these words begin to touch a deep chord, you can sustain this living energy through Super Chat, like someone feeding a flame that wishes to stay lit. There was a night that was no ordinary night. It was the night of the Jewish Passover, the night of the Seder, the night when the people of Israel remembered their liberation from Egypt with rites that had been transmitted without interruption for centuries. A night laden with a memory collective so profound that the air itself seemed to have a different weight. The house had been prepared to receive them. The owner had worked for days making sure everything was in order. The table was set with the usual ritual elements: the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the wine, the lit lamps, the cushions, arranged so the guests could recline as a sign of freedom, just as tradition prescribed. Everything was ready, or so it seemed. When the disciples began to arrive, they did so with that mix of reverence and anticipation that always accompanied the most important celebrations of the sacred calendar. They entered one by one, took their places, spoke in low voices about what had happened in the previous days, about the words they had heard, about what they felt was about to change, though none could have precisely explained why they felt that way. And then something unexpected happened. He arrived at the threshold of the door, but didn't enter immediately. He stood in that intermediate space between outside and inside, a space that in Semitic tradition was never just a passage, but a place with its own dignity, a sacred boundary, marking the difference between the world of the ordinary and the world of the intimate. And from that threshold, he looked. He looked with an attention his disciples had learned to recognize, because it was different from an ordinary gaze. It was the gaze of one who reads what others don't see. The walls, the corners, the air, as if the space itself were a text, and he was deciphering its invisible pages. The owner of the house approached, confused and a little uneasy. Everything was prepared, nothing visibly missing. But the question that came was the last one he expected to hear. A question so simple in its form and so profound in its content that those who heard it remembered it for years, decades, their entire lives. "What is this house missing?" The man looked around with new eyes, the same eyes he'd always had, but suddenly with a doubt that hadn't been there a minute before. The food was prepared. The family gathered. The rituals arranged. Everything tradition called for was present, and yet something in the way the question had been phrased made him feel there was something unseen, something the list of preparations didn't include because no one had taught him to include it. Without another word, the master walked out the door and disappeared into the street's darkness. Those who remained inside looked at each other, unsure what to think. Minutes passed that felt much longer than they actually were, and when he returned, he held something no one had anticipated. Not gold, not anointing oil, not any of the sacred elements that liturgical tradition prescribed for such occasions. He carried 3 plants, small, silent, still damp from the night. He held them with the same care others would have held objects of great value, and placed them in 3 different spots in the house, each in its place, each with a purpose. When he finished, he turned to those watching him in silence and said something that perhaps wasn't fully understood at that moment, but which time would eventually reveal in its full depth. The sacred doesn't arrive where there's no space prepared to receive it, and with that, he sat at the table and dinner began. But what had happened in those minutes? That simple, mysterious gesture of going out to find 3 plants and placing them in specific spots remained etched in the memory of those who witnessed it as something worth keeping, passing on, and cherishing. For generations, in many families who kept this memory alive, every Easter began with that same gesture. The conscious placement of those 3 plants as a superstition, not as decoration, but as a preparation of the space so that what was to be celebrated would have a truly worthy place to receive it. Over time, as happens with so many truly important things, that knowledge gradually faded away. The generations that came after inherited the form without the substance. They even lost the form and barely retained a vague feeling that homes should be prepared in some special way for Easter. But the knowledge about plants, about their meaning, about their energetic and spiritual function in the home was relegated to the margins, kept in popular traditions that the modern world gradually shifted into the category of folklore, seen as lacking depth. Because what you're about to hear now isn't folklore, it's functional knowledge about how living plants interact with the energy of an inhabited space, a knowledge that different spiritual traditions around the world have recognized in distinct but convergent ways, and that the experience of generations of families who practiced it confirms with a consistency that cannot be ignored. Now, my home is in the comment, and if you feel this wisdom deserves to be kept alive, if these words awaken something deep within you, you can support this teaching through a super chat, a conscious gesture of energetic gratitude. Every home has a point that defines it more than any other. Not the bedroom, even though it's where you rest. Not the kitchen, even though it's where life is nourished. Not the living room, even though it's where the family gathers. The point that defines a home more than any other is the threshold, that space between the door and the inside, that boundary where outside and inside meet. That place that appears to be just a passage, a square meter crossed without thinking dozens of times a day, is actually more than that. Among all the ancient cultures of the world, the threshold of the house held a sacred status, reflected in rituals, protective figures, offerings, and very specific prescriptions on how that space should be treated. The Romans had Janus, the god of beginnings and thresholds, whose image with two faces looking in opposite directions symbolized exactly that function of a boundary between two worlds. The Hebrews placed the mezuzah on the doorframe, that small container with a sacred parchment that marked the threshold of every Jewish home as a consecrated space. Traditional Japan, the Genkan, the entrance space of every home, was treated with a care and attention that reflected the understanding that what happened at that transition point affected the entire interior. And in European esoteric traditions that drew from Hermetic and Kabbalistic sources, there was explicit talk of the energy that visitors brought with them, and that they left at the threshold before entering deeper into the domestic space. This universal understanding of the threshold's importance wasn't superstition, it was the intuitive articulation of something direct experience confirms. When you pay attention, that spaces absorb and retain the energy of those who inhabit and frequent them. That a house visited by people in difficult emotional states, by repeated tensions, by frequent arguments, by constant worries, develops over time an atmosphere that can be felt even if it can't be seen, a kind of invisible density that affects the state of those who live in it in ways that are real, though hardly quantifiable. And the threshold is the first point where that accumulation occurs. It's the gateway not just for the body, but for everything the body carries with it. The fatigue from the workday, the tension of an unresolved conflict, the anxiety of a financial worry, the sadness of difficult news, all of that enters with people through the threshold and is deposited in invisible layers that time gradually makes denser. The first plant, placed that Easter night, was placed precisely there on the threshold, at that point of maximum vulnerability and utmost importance in the domestic space. And the chosen plant was hyssop. Hyssop, scientifically known as Hyssopus officinalis, is a plant mentioned in some of the oldest texts of the biblical tradition. In the book of Exodus, in the account of the first Passover, hyssop is the plant used to sprinkle the doorposts with the blood of the lamb, a gesture that marked the homes to be protected. It wasn't an arbitrary choice. Tradition knew something about hyssop that modern botany has partially confirmed. Its volatile compounds, the essential oils it naturally releases into the air, have antimicrobial and purifying properties that were recognized and used in medical and ritual contexts since ancient times. But beyond its chemical composition, hyssop holds a function in spiritual tradition that transcends the merely physical. It's a plant that doesn't block but filters, that doesn't repel but organizes, that doesn't create a barrier between outside and inside, but acts as a sieve, allowing what nourishes to pass through and retaining what contaminates. Placing hyssop near your home's entrance, on the doorframe, in a small pot by the threshold, or a dried branch intentionally placed in that transitional space, is to renew a gesture thousands of years old, practiced by entire generations of families, because experience had taught them it worked. Don't expect a dramatic and immediate change. Hyssop works in silence, just like all deeply effective things do. But over time, those who live in the space where hyssop guards the threshold begin to notice that the atmosphere inside the house is different, lighter, clearer, more capable of recovering quickly after the inevitable stresses of daily life, as if the space had a greater capacity to cleanse itself, to renew itself, to return to its natural state of balance after each disturbance. Now, write in the comments, "I protect the threshold of my home," and if writing it brings you clarity, if something within you aligns, you can support this shared energy through a super chat, like someone tending a flame to keep it burning. If the threshold is where the home begins, the center is where the home lives. It's the heart of the domestic space, the place everything returns to, from which everything radiates, where family life unfolds in its most everyday and most essential form. And there's something that happens in the centers of homes that very few people have learned to recognize, but once recognized, it cannot be ignored. There are homes that have a center, that have an invisible but real gravitational point from which the space is sustained, from which conversations flow naturally, from which rest comes effortlessly, from which family life finds its rhythm. And there are homes that lack that center, that feel scattered, fragmented, unable to sustain those who live in them, where conversations don't quite reach no place, where rest is never fully restorative, where there's a feeling of diffuse instability that can't be attributed to any specific cause, but is felt with a persistence that time doesn't resolve. This difference isn't always about the size of the house, its decor, or its material conditions. It has to do with something more subtle, with what could be called the energetic rootedness of the space, a home's ability to sustain those who live in it, in the same way that a deeply rooted tree can support its own weight and the weight of everything that grows around it, even when the winds are strong. And it was precisely to address this need that the second plant was brought inside the house, towards its center, towards the space where life happens with greater intensity. That plant was the olive tree. The olive tree is one of the trees most laden with spiritual meaning in all of Mediterranean and biblical tradition, not superficially or decoratively, but in a deeply functional way, rooted in direct observation of what this tree is and how it behaves. The olive tree can live for centuries. There are specimens in the Eastern Mediterranean that are estimated to be over 20 years old, trees that were alive when the New Testament stories occurred, that have been silent witnesses to generations and generations of human beings who were born, lived, and died while they continued their slow and patient growth. This longevity is not accidental. It's the result of a strategy of survival that the olive tree has developed through millions of years of evolution. Its roots, before growing upwards, before extending its branches, before producing fruit, the olive tree builds an extraordinarily deep and extensive root system that allows it to access water and nutrients in conditions that would kill most other plants. It doesn't seek immediate height. It doesn't compete for light before it's ready. First, it anchors. First, it holds firm. First, it ensures there's a sufficiently solid foundation for everything that comes after. In biblical tradition, the olive tree appears as a symbol of peace, abundance, of divine presence, after the storm. In the story of the flood, it's an olive branch that the dove brings to Noah as a sign that the waters have receded and the earth is habitable again. It wasn't an oak branch, nor cedar, nor any other powerful or imposing tree. It was an olive branch, discreet and laden with oil, announcing the possibility of starting anew on solid ground. The olive oil anointed the kings of Israel, marking them as chosen to sustain the people. It anointed the sick in healing rituals. It fueled the temple lamps, keeping the sacred flame lit even on the longest nights. The olive tree was the tree of substance that sustains, that nourishes, that illuminates, that heals. When an olive branch, a small olive plant, or even olive leaves intentionally arranged, enter the center of a home, they bring with them all that symbolic and energetic charge, not magically or instantly, but in the way all profound things work, gradually, silently, with the patience of someone who knows that roots are built slowly and that this time isn't wasted time, but time well spent. Families who for generations maintained the practice of placing olive branches in the center of their home during Easter described the effect with words that repeat with surprising consistency, that the space felt more grounded, that rest was deeper, that conversations more easily found common ground, that conflicts were resolved with less drama. Not because the olive branch solved problems, but because it helped create an environment where human beings could more easily access their own ability to solve them. Now, write in the comments, "My home grows deep roots." And if, as you write these words, you feel a calm slowly descending, if something inside you starts to relax, you can support this teaching through a super chat, like someone planting a seed so it keeps growing. There's a dimension of homes that most people intuitively know, but very few allow themselves to examine clearly. It's the dimension of memory, not personal memory, stored in the brains of those who inhabit the space, but the memory of the space itself. The ability of physical environments to retain impressions, to absorb the emotional charge of what happens within them, and to keep it active in ways that subtly affect the state of those who inhabit them long after the original event has ended. Environmental psychologists have documented in decades of research what spiritual traditions knew long before, that the physical characteristics of an environment, its smells, its colors, its acoustics, its temperature, profoundly affect the emotional and cognitive state of the people who inhabit it. That environments have the power to activate memories, to evoke emotional states, to influence the level of stress or relaxation in a way that operates below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. But spiritual traditions went even further in their understanding of this phenomenon. They described that spaces where events with a strong emotional charge had occurred, a bereavement, a prolonged conflict, a painful separation, a long period of anguish or depression, developed a kind of energetic saturation that could persist for years and influence the state of those who lived in them, even when those people knew nothing of the space's prior history. This explains something that many people have experienced without being able to name it. The feeling that there are rooms in certain homes where one doesn't want to stay long without knowing exactly why, or the feeling of heaviness that appears when crossing certain thresholds, or the difficulty of truly resting in certain spaces, even though the objective conditions for rest are present. These are not fantasies nor exaggerated sensitivities. They're intuitive readings of something that's truly present, even if invisible. And the third plant placed that Easter night was specifically placed to address this dimension of space, to do something the first two gestures, protecting the threshold and rooting the center, couldn't do alone, to release what the space had held. That plant was rosemary. Rosemary, 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 sulficinalis, whose Latin name literally means dew of the sea, is a plant that the history of medicine and spiritual traditions across many cultures has associated with memory, mental clarity, and renewal. In ancient Greece, students wore rosemary wreaths on their heads during exams. As tradition held, it improved memory and concentration. In funeral rituals across many Mediterranean cultures, rosemary was burned or placed around the body of the deceased, not just as a natural preservative, but as a symbol that even if the body returned to the earth, the memory of the loved one would remain. In medieval Christian tradition, rosemary was called the plant of remembrance and used in weddings and funerals, in celebrations and farewells, as a presence honoring life's continuity through time. But there's something fundamental that distinguishes rosemary's effect on memory from any other plant. Rosemary doesn't activate just any memory. It activates memories that heal, memories that connect, memories that restore a person's sense of continuity and belonging, their ability to see themselves as part of something larger than the difficult moment they're living. The essential oils rosemary releases into the air, especially one, 8-cineol, have been studied in modern scientific contexts. Their ability to activate specific cognitive and emotional responses, stimulate cerebral circulation, and reduce biochemical markers of stress has been documented. But beyond biochemistry, rosemary does something that can be described as a reorganization of the emotional field of the space it's in. It doesn't eliminate the difficult memories a space has accumulated. It transforms them, integrates them, removes the burden of compulsive repetition that makes certain atmospheres seem impossible to abandon, and returns them to their natural place in the past, allowing the present to regain its openness, its ability to accommodate the new without the old constantly blocking the way. That's why rosemary should be placed near the light, in the brightest window of the house, in the kitchen where fire and activity keep the air moving, at any point where the energy of the space flows more easily, because rosemary needs light to do its complete work. It needs the sun's warmth to release its oils with the necessary fullness. And in that release, in that process of giving to the air what it holds within, it performs its deepest function to open the space so that what deserves to remain remains, and what has already served its time can finally leave. Now write in the comments, I release the past of my home. And if, as you write it, you feel something stir within you, as if a weight begins to lift, you can support this energy with a super chat, like someone opening space for the new to enter. There's a symptom that repeats in homes all over the world, in large and small houses, in modern apartments and old dwellings, in large families, and for people who live alone. A symptom that conventional medicine doesn't know how to classify because it doesn't fit into any clear diagnostic category. It's the symptom of waking up, tired. Not the tiredness that comes from not having slept enough hours, but the tiredness that appears even after a full night's sleep. That feeling that the body rested but something deeper didn't. That something inside wasn't completely renewed during sleep that you wake up carrying the same weight you went to bed with the night before. This is more common than most people are willing to admit, and its most frequent cause isn't physical. It's the energetic quality of the space where you sleep, of the home where you live, a space that has accumulated over years or decades, layers of unprocessed emotions, unresolved tensions, incomplete of worries repeated over and over in the same corners. It develops a density that affects rest in ways that have no explanation in purely physical terms, but that are completely real in terms of experience. The traditions of Chinese geomancy, feng shui, for thousands of years, has described how the layout and energetic quality of spaces affect the health, relationships, prosperity, and spiritual well-being those who inhabit them. India's Vastu Shastra tradition does the same. Indigenous traditions of America have their own systems for understanding how spaces accumulate and transmit energy. All these traditions, developed independently in completely different cultural contexts, point in the same direction, that the space where one lives is not a neutral container. It's an active participant in the lives of those who inhabit it. And when that participant is saturated, when there hasn't been a cleansing and a conscious renewal of the space for prolonged periods, its influence on the quality of life of those who inhabit it can be significantly negative in ways that are subtle but cumulative. There are 3 signs that appear most frequently when a home needs an energetic renewal. The first is sleep that doesn't restore. Sleeping and waking up without having rested, as if the resting space were too saturated to allow for the deep regeneration the body needs. The second is the existence of avoided areas. There are homes where certain corners, certain rooms, certain spaces are instinctively avoided without anyone being able to explain exactly why. You pass through them quickly. You avoid staying in them. You feel a diffuse discomfort that the rational mind dismisses as imagination, but the body takes seriously. The third sign is the persistence of the past. The feeling that certain situations, certain relational patterns, certain emotional states just don't go away, even though objectively there's no longer any reason for them to be present, as if the space keeps them alive by its own inertia, as if the walls remember what people have already tried to forget. These signs are not spiritual dramatizations. They are information about the real state of the space where you live. And Easter, with its deep symbolism of passage, of crossing from one state to another, of death and resurrection, of liberation from what enslaves and openness to what frees, is the most powerful time of the year to heed these signs, to do what the Master did that night. Stop at the threshold, honestly. Look at what is missing, and take the simple but deeply meaningful action of preparing the space to receive the sacred. Now write in the comments, and if you feel these words describe something real in your life, if you recognize that silent sign, you can support this spiritual space through a super chat, like someone responding to an inner calling. All knowledge that remains at the level of intellectual understanding without descending to the level of concrete action is like a seed that is never. It can be beautiful, it can be perfect, in its design. It can contain within it all the necessary information to produce a magnificent tree. But as long as it remains in your hand and doesn't come into contact with the earth, it won't bear fruit. What you're about to do now doesn't require any elaborate preparation. It doesn't require a special mood or perfect external conditions. It only requires what any truly sacred act has always required: genuine presence and clear intention. These two elements are what transform an ordinary gesture into a ritual. And a ritual, properly understood, is not a ceremony empty of meaning. It's an act that humans perform on the threshold between the everyday and the sacred. An act that says with the language of the body and attention what words don't always manage to express. That this moment matters, that this space matters, that what I do now, I do with awareness of its meaning. Before you begin, take a moment to mentally step out of the automatic mode in which most daily actions are performed. It doesn't need to be long. A few seconds of conscious breathing are enough to establish that difference in quality of attention that distinguishes a ritual from a simple household chore. The first step begins where everything in this knowledge begins, on the threshold. Hold the swab in your hands, and before you place it, pause for a moment to just hold it. Feel its texture, observe its shape, and if you can, smell its unique aroma, that clean scent and slightly minty scent that has been associated with purification in so many traditions. This moment of conscious contact before placing the plant has a very specific purpose: to activate your intention, to make the act you're about to perform a chosen act, not an automatic one. When you reach the threshold of your home, that space between the door and the inside, pause there for another moment. Notice that space with an attention you may have never given it before. Feel the difference between being inside and being outside. Feel what that boundary means, and then, with the same awareness, place the swab where it belongs. It can be on the door frame. It can be in a small pot right next to the entrance. It can be hung from the doorknob or placed in the space that visually marks the beginning of your home. There's no rigid rule about the exact shape. What exists is a clear understanding of its purpose. This is the guardian of the threshold. This small, discreet presence will filter what enters, not with the violence of one who blocks, but with the wisdom of one who orders. Once you've placed it, stay there for a moment. Don't do anything else, and just allow your attention to acknowledge what just happened. You said something with that gesture. Even if you didn't utter a single word, you said, "This threshold now has a guardian. This boundary is aware." The second step takes you towards the heart of the home. Take the olive tree, whether it's a small plant, a branch, or leaves carefully arranged in a container, and take them to the center of this space where the people living in this house spend most of their time. As you walk towards that spot, do so with the same awareness as those who carried offerings to ancient temples, not with exaggerated solemnity, but with an attention that honors the importance of what you're doing. Upon reaching the chosen spot, before placing the olive branch, lower your shoulders. This physical action has a direct energetic correspondence. Releasing the tension in your shoulders is releasing the burden carried in the body, and that physical release creates space for something more. Place the olive branch in its spot with the attention of someone planting something, not someone just leaving an object. Because even if it's a dry branch, even if it's just a simple bunch of leaves, the conscious act of placing it in that central space is an act of grounding. It's telling the home that it has a center, that this center is being recognized and honored, that from there the life of this house will be sustained with greater firmness. Stay with that plant for a moment. Let that moment settle. The third step takes you towards the light, towards the kitchen, towards the largest window, towards the space where the sun enters most generously, towards the point where the outside air and the inside of the house meet most easily. Take the rosemary. Of the three plants, this one responds most to touch and warmth. If you can touch its leaves before placing it, contact releases its essential oils and begins the purification process, even before the plant is in its final spot. When you place the rosemary in that bright space, do so with a specific awareness that you are performing an act of liberation, not destruction, not a denial of the past, but a liberation of what has already served its purpose in that space. It erases the history of a home, transforms it, removes the burden of repetition, and returns it to its natural place in the past, from where it can be honored without continuing to create a burden in the present. When the three gestures are complete, when the guardian is at the threshold, the root in the center, and the liberator in the light, pause in the space of your home and simply pay attention. Don't look for spectacular signs. The changes these plants produce are silent and gradual, like the growth of roots that cannot be seen but can be felt in the firmness of the tree. What you'll most likely notice in the days that follow is a slight but unmistakable difference in the quality of the atmosphere. Something cleaner, something firmer, something freer. Now write in the comments, "My home is being prepared." And if, while imagining these steps, you felt an emotion, a clarity, a feeling difficult to explain, you can support this experience through a super chat, like someone honoring a sacred moment lived from the heart. Easter is not simply a date on the religious calendar. In its deepest meaning, at that level where spiritual traditions converge beyond their doctrinal differences, Easter is the archetype of passage, of crossing, of transformation, irreversible, that happens when something old ends and something new begins. The name itself says it. Pisa in Hebrew, which means to pass over, alludes to the moment when the angel passed over the marked houses and preserved them. But that passing over wasn't just an external event. It was the visible manifestation of something that had first happened internally. The preparation, the readiness, the decision to be prepared for what was coming. The families who painted their doorposts with the sign of the Lamb were not performing a magical act that would transfer automatic protection from an external agent. They were performing an act of alignment, of declaration, of conscious choice about the kind of reality they wanted to live in. And that choice, expressed through a physical gesture made with full intention, had consequences. Because acts performed with genuine intention at moments of greatest symbolic weight have a power that the same acts performed at any other ordinary time don't have to the same degree. This is something that all spiritual traditions around the world have recognized, that there are moments in the cycle of time that are portals, points of greater openness between the visible and the invisible, between the mundane and the sacred, between the state one is in and the state one can reach. Passover is one of those moments, and the practice of preparing the home during Easter with the three plants is not a mere folkloric custom without depth. It's the conscious use of that temporal portal's power to carry out in the domestic space a transformation that at any other time would require much more time and much more effort. When the three plants work together in a home space during the Easter period, when hyssop filters the threshold, the olive tree roots the center, and rosemary releases accumulated memory, what happens can be described as a resonance, an alignment between the work the plants perform in the physical space and the work that the energy of Eastertime performs at the spiritual level. Both point in the same direction, towards liberation, towards the passage from one state to another, towards a renewal that doesn't deny the past but integrates and transcends it. The effects of this resonance aren't identical for homes or for all families. They depend on the specific history of the space, on the depth of intention with which the practice is done, on the openness of those who live in that home to receive what this renewal brings. But there are patterns that repeat with enough frequency to be able to describe them with some confidence. The first is a change in sleep quality. Families who practiced this during generations described that in the days following the placement of the plants during Passover, sleep became deeper, more restorative, more capable of renewing genuinely the body and spirit. The second pattern is what could be called a greater relational ease. Difficult conversations that had long been postponed began to happen with less drama. Misunderstandings that had created distance between people living under the same roof began to dissolve, not because of any event spectacular, but by a kind of softening of the atmosphere that made defensiveness give way a little and openness found more space. The third pattern, perhaps the most difficult to describe but the most mentioned by those who have experienced it, is a greater presence of what could be called the sacred dimension of everyday life, a greater ability to recognize the extraordinary within the ordinary, to feel that the everyday gestures of the home, shared meals, rest, conversation, childcare, the silence of the night, have a depth and a meaning that the noise and rush of modern life often overshadow, as if the renewed home would remind those living in it that the life happening within its walls, it's not just a step between events, it is the most important event itself. It is in itself the place where the sacred can manifest most fully if the space is prepared to receive it. Now write in the comments, "My home is filled with presence divine." And if you feel this teaching can transform your life, if something within you recognizes its value, you can expand this conscious community through a super chat. Share light so that it reaches more homes. Now I want you to remember the first question, the one asked in silence on the threshold of a home prepared for Passover. What is this house missing? Today, that question is no longer empty. Today, It has an answer. 3 plants, 3 living presences, 3 simple gestures that restore meaning to the space where you live. Because your home is not just a place to sleep, it's space where your energy is formed, where your spirit is renewed, where your soul rests. Every Passover is an opportunity to start anew, not outside, but inside, in the place where you wake up, where you breathe, where you live. This channel exists for those who feel something within them is awakening, for those who seek meaning and not noise, for those who know that the spiritual is not far, but near, in simple gestures, in conscious acts, in the care of the space where they dwell. If this message resonated with you, if you feel you are part of this community of awakening souls, you can subscribe and walk alongside those seeking to live with more. And if you wish to support this spiritual space, if you feel this message deserves to keep reaching other homes, you can do so through a super chat as a silent gesture of support this shared light. Now, keep this phrase within you. When I prepare my home, I prepare my spirit. And remember, the next time you cross your threshold, you won't just be entering a house, you'll be entering a sacred space that you yourself chose to awaken.